People ask me, how do you define wealth? You define wealth when your young daughter, before you step on the Joe Rogan platform, writes this to you.
She wrote, "I love you." That's very cute.
That's wealth. I'm a billionaire.
Yeah. It's valuable. Wouldn't say it's wealth. I think you're not being accurate with your words.
By the way, I will probably keep this forevermore.
You should, yeah, definitely. Don't put it in your pocket. What if you sweat on it?
Okay, I'll leave it here. How's
Yeah.
that?
So we were talking right before the podcast started about what I was just talking about in the previous podcast about Patreon and what Patreon has done to deplatform Sargon of Akkad and what I think we both agree was sloppy use of language on his part. But I don't believe he was saying something racist. He was using a racist word, though. He was using it to describe someone. He was actually using it against white nationalists.
Exactly.
And against white supremacists and saying how ridiculous they were being and that they were being exactly what they describe and when they're using racist terms to describe black people. But he did it using those terms, and it wasn't a good speech. Like what he said, and one of the things that I'd said on the previous podcast is when you do podcast, you're not mapping out what you're going to say. You're free-flowing. Sometimes words come out clunky, and I think that was what was going on in the case with him in this particular conversation that he had. It wasn't even on his page. Yeah. And Patreon decided to ban him, and I think for him that was something to the tune of like $12,000 or more a month.
Yeah.
So quite a bit of his income.
You know, a lot of us then suggested that people move to Subscribestar, which was another platform that came out of nowhere, and they've now been shut down.
How'd they get shut down?
I don't know the details, so I hope I'm not misspeaking, but I think PayPal and Stripe decided that somehow they're violating, their terms of their terms of service for whatever reason, and apparently any payouts that have gone out are safe, but it won't happen through PayPal or through Stripe. So you have to find some alternate platform. I think Payoneer or something. So it's getting difficult to even receive the generous donations from people.
So a lot of people that are doing podcasts and doing these YouTube shows, they operate on donations, which is a really fair way to do things, because if you have a subscription-based service and you're asking people, like say for Sirius Satellite Radio or something like that, you might not be happy with the content. You might choose to cancel your subscription, but these people can get what they get already for free.
Right.
They choose to donate because they think it's valuable to them, which is really interesting. I like that format, that model, because for the longest time, people were trying to figure out how could you make money off the internet. Well, the idea was advertising revenue, and Sam Harris has a lengthy rant that's very accurate about this that he puts on his podcast often. It's like a 7-minute rant explaining why he doesn't use ads and why he prefers to have people just donate what they would like. And he was one of the biggest Patreon people. He was one of the biggest accounts on Patreon. Right. He pulled his Patreon 2 days ago.
Right.
And, that was a huge statement because to him, that is incredibly valuable.
I'm really curious to know what Jack Conte, the founder of Patreon, what his ultimate trajectory is going to be. As someone who teaches psychology of decision-making, who studies decision-making, who's housed in a business school, I think it would be a wonderful case analysis down the road, probably Harvard will teach it, of whether he just doubles down, which it seems like this is what they're doing because they released a statement that didn't seem to suggest that there was any sort of possibility of reflection on their part. Do you have a sense of whether the market will allow him to sort of realign his thinking, or do you think he's just going to double down all the way to hell?
I think he's going to weather the storm, if I'm going to be completely honest. Not what I would like. What I would like is for them to support free speech and for them to make a differentiation between what is actual hate speech and what is a clunky use of language, which is what I think Sargon did.
Right.
It was a clunky use of language. And I think Sargon's a very intelligent guy. I've had him on the podcast. I've talked to him. He's very bright. And I've
been on the show several times.
He makes great points.
Yeah.
He's a very smart guy. When he was on... it just, when he's on someone else's show doing that, I felt like, and this is one of the things I said in the last podcast, I feel like if people decide that what he did was offensive to them to the point where they decided to not renew their subscriptions or not continue to send him money through Patreon, that's probably the best use of that format and the best way for them and the market to decide. That's really, I think, how it should be done.
Incidentally, regarding the N-word, and I'm sure Jamie will now double-check what I'm saying, as he always does, there was a dean at some university, I think, out maybe in Seattle, I could be wrong, that at some point had suggested, someone had asked which book, a student had asked, which book should I read, or I can't remember the exact story. And I think the title of the book was The N-Word. And she had, I think the dean was a woman, if I'm not mistaken, had simply recommended that book.
But she said the word out loud.
Or he or she, I can't remember again the person's sex, got into trouble. So, I wonder if we shouldn't just sort of demystify this word. I mean, if people weren't so, I mean, we have to now say the N-word.
Right.
We now have to say the R word. I got banned from Twitter for 12 hours because at one point I was interacting with some schmuck who I called retarded, degenerate, schmuck, whatever it was. I can't remember the exact combination of insults. And I was banned for using the R word. So, I mean, where does this end? I mean, how many more words do we have to remove from the lexicon? I mean, don't give these words so much power. Don't be so sensitive. I mean, I know we've talked about these kinds of issues in the past, but does it not seem to you outrageous that someone who recommends a book with the title being the N-word gets into trouble? I mean, it's insane.
Well, there's an even better one. Netflix, there was an executive at Netflix that was forced to resign due to my friend Tom Segura's comedy special. And my friend Tom Segura has a bit in his act about how there's certain words that are just gone, you can't use anymore. And he says, retard. He's like, that word, you can't use that word anymore. And he goes on, and it's not about using that word. He's not justifying the use of the word. He's just simply stating that this is a word that you could no longer use. So they get attacked, a bunch of letter writing campaign from mental health organizations and people dealing with people that have disabilities, and are saying that you're being ableist and you're being discriminatory and all these different things, and they're basically trying to silence him. Even though if you look at the actual bit itself, he's not using it to describe a person. It's just essentially acknowledging that the word exists. So this guy who's an executive at Netflix says in a meeting, you can't use that word because that word, it's like saying nigger around black people.
Right.
Just says that.
You're going to get in trouble now.
No, I said it in the earlier show too. I'm just saying, when I read Sargon of Akkad's thing, it's preposterous to say the N-word. And I've said the N-word before, and in most cases I will say it, but he actually said the word. And the reason why he said the word, and the reason why I just said the word, is because he was trying to demonstrate that this is an offensive thing. Like saying retard is just like saying that. He gets fired for that, for simply making this comparison that, and we're talking about uncensored stand-up comedy. By the way, this is a network that features that word prominently on several different comedy specials in multiple situations. Whether it's Cat Williams, multiple uses of the word, Dave Chappelle. I mean, that word gets thrown about like a beach ball at a fucking concert. That word gets tossed around a lot. But this guy's saying it because he's white. They're like, enough of your work here, sir.
Speaking of comedy and sort of political correctness with comedy, in my forthcoming book, I have a section where I talk about professors who got into trouble. I mean, we've all heard about the comedians getting into trouble for violating some politically correct dictum, but professors, in many cases, very, very high-profile professors, getting in trouble for incredibly innocuous jokes. And actually, I brought a list of names because I thought I might not remember them. Can I mention a few?
Sure.
A few of the cases? So Lazar Greenfield, who was the president-elect of the American College of Surgeons and the editor-in-chief of a journal called Surgery News, had written an editorial a few years ago where he was talking about the antidepressant benefits of coming in contact with sperm. In other words, and this was based on a peer-reviewed scientific paper. Actually, two of the authors of that paper are folks that I know quite well, friends of mine. And they had demonstrated that women who have protected sex versus unprotected sex end up scoring differently on these depressive measures. In other words, there was some sort of protective element to actually being exposed to sperm. And so in his editorial, he made a joke. It was during Valentine's. He said, so now there is a gift that a man can give a woman that's beyond flowers or chocolates or something to that effect. He had to step down from being president of the American College of Surgeons. He had to step down from being editor-in-chief because a whole bunch of women were very offended by that sperm joke. Now, the authors of the paper in question wrote a brilliant response where they said, how could he be treated in this way when all he was doing is actually literally reporting the data, the findings from our peer-reviewed study? So that's one example. Another example is Sir Tim, I think it's Sir Tim Hunt, who was a Nobel Prize winner in 2001.
I remember this one, yeah.
Right. Who he was speaking, I think, in Korea at a women in science conference, where he very, in a jocular way, said, it's a real problem when you have women in your lab. They fall in love with you, you fall in love with them, and so it's better to have segregated labs. His wife, by the way, is a staunch feminist who's a very prominent scientist, and she confirmed that he's hardly, a rabid sexist. He went through all sorts of hell.
Yeah, I remember that, and he was joking.
And he was joking, and I in the book I discussed several other of these examples. So imagine, you would think that a unblemished, exemplary career as a scientist, up to getting a Nobel Prize, could potentially protect you. But one comment that someone decides can unleash the tsunami of outrage, and you're dead.
Well, I think the problem is reacting to the people that are reacting to the comment.
Right.
It's not the comment itself. It's the cowards that are running things that give in to that. And the Netflix thing is particularly disturbing because it was internal. It was people that were working in this department that apparently went and protested, and they just decided that his use was egregious and he shouldn't be able to say those sounds with his face.